Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
We're talking about, this is our Tuesday morning class on ideas about God, which we're tracing through Jewish history and trying to put them together so that we can all construct our individual theology, ideas about God as we daven to help us daven. If you didn't listen to last week's class, if you're out there in somewhere land and you didn't listen to last week's class, you got to listen to last week's class first. Otherwise, you might be a little bit lost. We're talking about the classic Kabbalah's idea about the unfolding in God through aspects of God called the Sefirot, the 10 aspects, attributes, aspects of God, manifestations of God. Again, classical Kabbalah means 100 to 200 years before the Zohar and 100 to 200 years after the Zohar about 1290. So loosely speaking, let us say the first half of the second millennium, 1000, 1100-ish, up till 1500-ish, up till Rabbi Isaac Luria comes along and has I don't want to say different in the sense of conflicting, but he really changes and deepens Kabbalistic ideas about God. So that's going to be phase 2 of medieval mysticism. We're not up to that yet. We're in phase 1. And just to tell you where we're at, we talked about the Sefirot last week. I'll recap that very quickly. We're going to talk about the remaining Sefirot today. Then other aspects that I will want to talk about in the next few weeks about classical Kabbalah will have to do with separation of male and female and the reuniting of male and female, which is an important principle, right? So sexual union in the universe, that's one thing. Then the Shekhinah, the presence of God in the universe, the indwelling presence of God in the universe. So those are the 2 things that we're going to do after we, quote unquote, finish with the Sefirot. So to recap briefly where we're at last week, God decides to manifest God's self in the world by flowing into different channels or aspects that are called the Sefirot, and flowing, the technical term that's used is atzilut, which is emanation, but there are metaphors that sometimes are about flowing of light. I think as modern people, a lot of people like this idea because there are all kinds of things in, let's say, modern physics that talk about flow of energy. So if the Kabbalah were written in California today, it would be called flow of energy, metaphorically, because, they didn't know it. I think they didn't use the word energy in the year 1290. It's sometimes likened to light. Various other metaphors, a flower unfolding, water flowing through different levels. And all of these are aspects of God, the one God, who manifests through different attributes. These are the things that are accessible to us. And we talked about 3 aspects of the Sefirot last time. 1, they're how we apprehend or understand God. 2, we can affect those aspects of God, and we can affect God by the way we conduct ourselves. So the first one was called theosophy, understanding God. The second one was theurgy, which means we do things that affect God. That's why doing a mitzvah strengthens the deity in Chabad, Lubavitch. We talked about that extensively last time. And 3 is there is also a psychological aspect to the 10 attributes of God. So people say, like, just as God has love and compassion, chesed, so there's an aspect of us that's chesed. And as with the divine realm, if we don't have enough chesed, then the world is off kilter. And if we have too much chesed, the world is off kilter. And that has to be in balance with the other side. So the Sefirot are talked about in various books theosophically, theurgically, and psychologically, human psychology. Okay. So I'm just gonna review where we were with the Sefirot. I'm gonna try to screen share. So I'm gonna flip all the way back up. It's gonna make you dizzy. All this is review. Okay. So we said, for those who are listening at home, it's the same handout as last week. I'll ask Bert to attach the handout again this week so you don't have to scroll back and forth. Okay, so we said that outside the realm of the Sefirot, there's the aspect of God which is called, it's up here, and you can barely read it in this Xerox copy, the Ein Sof, or the infinite, and that's outside of anything we can apprehend. And as I said last week, as I read it as a layperson, I am not a scholar of medieval anything. There isn't a huge difference between the Ein Sof and Maimonides' idea about God. Okay, they sound pretty similar to me. The infinite, which is fundamentally unknowable and out there. So the Ein Sof, the infinite, decides to reveal God's self into the world and gives rise to the first of the Sefirot, which is called Keter, or crown. And crown is also just about entirely unknowable by us. And when you read about Ein Sof and Keter, you might end up saying, oh, those sound, I don't know, they sound pretty similar. So they can sound pretty similar. Okay, but it's the beginning of God's will in the world, again, inaccessible to us, which gives rise to two channels, you can think of them as bowls holding water, or lamps holding light that then spill the light into the next thing. Gives rise to Chokhmah and then Bina. We talked about this extensively last time. Chokhmah is undifferentiated wisdom. We can say it's God's mind that contains all the possibilities of what there's going to be in the universe. And then Bina, or which really doesn't have a good translation. I translate it as discernment, but that's not really the right word. I'll try to think of a better word. Say it. Anyone have a better word for Bina? It's differentiated wisdom, which means all the specifics of God's thought. Ways I can read this. Okay. Sorry. I don't have a good translation. I'm just going to call it differentiated wisdom, which is not a very good translation. Okay. Let me get you back. I can't see you anymore. You can see me, right? Okay, you're back. Sorry. Let's see you. This is my problem.
Rabbi Chorny just walked by and said discernment.
Thank you. Yeah, is that what I said? I said that, but it's like that just substitutes a Hebrew word for a complicated English word. So like, because you could say to me, well, what does discernment mean? Okay, so basically, it's the difference between undifferentiated wisdom and discernment, or specific knowledge. I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble here. You can see the piece of paper? Okay. I can't. Where is it? I'm going to stop sharing for a brief moment. And now it's gone. And now I'm going to try to reshare. And then, okay. So basically, Chokhmah and Bina. Chokhmah is conceived of as male, and Bina is conceived of as female. Chokhmah is sometimes called Abba, great father, and Bina is Ima, great mother, or supernal mother, highest mother. So Chokhmah means in God's mind, air quotes, all the possibilities of everything that would exist in the world. Bina is kind of the specifics. You can say Chokhmah is abstract Torah and Bina is actual written Torah. Okay. And as Alan mentioned last time, there's an invisible sphera between them called Da'at, or Deah. By the way, in the Sephardic Siddur, the bracha and the Shema, where we ask God's, the bracha Chonein HaDa'at, which is the first bracha after Ha'el HaKadosh, the fourth bracha. Ata chonen la'adam da'at, umlamed le'enosh binah, chonenu me'itcha. In the Ashkenazi Siddur, it's Deah, Binah, v'Haskel. In the Sephardi Siddur, it's chonenu me'itcha, chochma, Binah, v'Da'at. Okay, give us these three attributes. So I'm not going to talk about that more. These give rise to another set called Chesed and Din, and a lot of Kabbalah focuses, a lot of the Kabbalah about the Sefirot focuses on Chesed and Din because I think because those are things that are very easily understandable to us. Okay, Chesed is boundless love, sometimes translated compassion. Okay, and Din, which is also called Gevura, is sometimes translated as restraint, boundedness, or severity. I embrace my child because of my chesed as a parent, and I scold my child because of my din as a parent. And these two things balance each other. We said last week, and the Midrash says one of the sins of the major sin of the generation of Noah is that it was unbounded chesed. People had sex indiscriminately with each other in an unbounded way and had sex with animals, and animals had sex with animals across species. The sin was the sin of too much chesed, right? Too much chesed also means your child, you love your child, so that you say, yeah, you can eat whatever you want. You can go to sleep whenever you want. You can do whatever you want because I love you so much. I can't possibly set boundaries. On the other hand, Din, too much din means you're too strict and boundaried and punishing. So Chesed and Din are two Sefirot, two aspects of God, which are very, very easy for us to, I think, relate to psychologically as human beings, and that may be why classical Kabbalah spends a lot of time on the issue of balancing these two things. Hashem balances these two things as tiferet, which is frequently translated as beauty, but it's really beauty in the sense of beautifully harmonious, as if when you see a picture or a human or something in nature and you say that is beautiful, what is implied behind that is that things that you observe in that person or that painting or that view of nature are somehow harmonious. They fit together. So the correct balancing of Chesed and Din is called Tiferet. Now, by the way, a mnemonic for remembering 5 Sefirot is Lecha Hashem Hagedula V'Hagvura V'Hatiferet V'Hanetzach V'Hahod. When we take the Torah out, okay. So, these are Gedula and Gevura. So Chesed and Din are sometimes called Gedula, greatness, and Gevura, might or something like that. So God's greatness is God's unbounded compassion or love, and God's Gevura is God's severity or restriction. You could say historically we crossed the Red Sea because of God's chesed, and the Egyptians were drowned because of God's din. That's kind of like a simple way of putting it. And you can say, of course, this reminds you, if it does remind you, of rabbinic literature, which says God has two aspects, midat harachamim and midat hadin, the attribute of compassion and the attribute of severity. And remember, we read a midrash about, God's, again, the rabbinic midrash, very imagistic. God gets up from God's throne of compassion. Other way. God gets up from God's throne of severity, stricture, punishment, right? And God moves over and sits on God's throne of compassion, right? So we hope that, the shofar blowing during the high holidays gets God to get up from the throne of Din and sit on the throne of Chesed. That's kind of how the Midrash expresses it. So this idea of God having Midat Hadin and Midat Harachamim is very familiar to us from rabbinic midrash, and it gets incorporated into the Sefirot. Brief pause. Michael.
Well, that last comment, that's exactly what I was going to ask about. And furthermore, that same concept makes its way into English common law. I talked to Debbie tonight about it, about courts of law and courts of chancery. It's the same concept.
Okay. Could you, for those of us who know nothing about chanceries, could you just give like 2 or 3 sentences on what you just said, what it actually means?
Yeah, originally there was only one system of justice under common law. That was the law courts.
Okay.
But the king and others realized that sometimes strict adherence to the law was just not just, and so the king developed a second parallel court system.
Yeah.
Courts of chancery, we call it in any event, the chancery courts, to handle cases and to essentially overrule law in cases where the application of the law would be unfair.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you. Interesting. And you remember there was that midrash also. Rabbi Yishmael, I think, goes behind the curtain on Yom Kippur. It's a Kohen Gadol. He sees God sitting on the Kruvim, and he says, "Yishmael, Yishmael, my son, bless me." Again, you just got to love rabbinic midrash in terms of the way it just has the chutzpah to anthropomorphize. And Yishmael says, and I don't remember exactly. They say to Rabbi Yishmael, no, Rabbi Yishmael says, God, what kind of blessing can I give you? And God says, oh, the blessing should be Yehi Ratzon, right? May it be my will, right? That my Rachamim overrules my din, okay? My mercy overrules my strict letter of the law. And of course, that is what, right? That's what the major theme of the high holidays, right? Utshuva, utfila, utzdaka, ma'avirin et roa hagzera. We hope we do these things: prayer, good deeds, and right, repentance, prayer, and good deeds, so that the severity of the din will be, meaning what we know we all deserve because we haven't been great people, that may be mitigated by God's chesed. Okay, so the perfect balance of those two things is called tiferet, beauty, but it really means perfect harmony. By the way, you may notice, because, numbers are fun, this makes sort of a triad, and this realm of the triad is sometimes referred to as the conceptual or intellectual realm, usually beyond us. This part of the triad is sometimes called the emotional or psychological realm. Now I'm going to move down, quote unquote, down. Okay. And sometimes the Kabbalah does say explicitly lower, flowing from above towards below. And sometimes it's just, these things are just seen as different rather than higher and lower. But here's where we kind of stopped last time. Netzach and Hod. And Netzach and Hod, all authors will say, anything you read about the Kabbalah, are less well developed than Chesed and Din. Netzach means literally eternity. It's something about God's power. And Hod literally means majesty, power and majesty. I don't know what to do with that. I will say to you that Hod is associated with prophecy, and Netzach is associated with was I going to say priesthood? I know. Sorry that I'm fiddling around. They're associated with Moses and Aaron, Moses being the representative prophet, and I'm thinking of a better word than priesthood for Aharon. I'm sorry, I'm trying to scroll successfully. All right. Rabbi Deborah Silver, I asked her where she got this. She said she got it at an Institute of Jewish Spirituality thing, and I actually like this formulation, what I'm about to say, better. Like it better means it works better for me. And that is, she repeats, sorry, Netzach, triumph, and Hod, majesty. Okay, Netzach inspires prophecy, and Hod, sorry, thank you. Hod is providence. God, providence, meaning God tending to everything in the world. Netzach and the power of prophecy is associated with Moses, because all these Sefirot are associated with a particular ancestor, and Hod is associated with Aaron. Rabbi Deborah Silver brought to me from the Institute of Jewish Spirituality the terms striving and stillness. And I'm not sure that if that is a straight up, legit understanding of Netzach and Hod, but I find it useful because on the human level, we all understand striving and stillness, right? I don't know, 6 days of the week is striving, Shabbos is stillness. There's times in our relationships and whatever we're doing in the world when what we're doing is we're trying to exert our power. Netzach is also sometimes translated as endurance. Okay. By the way, these words they're not particularly useful if you're just looking at them in modern Israeli. So, Netzach would be, eternal victory. Okay. But it's more, the sense in Kabbalah is about endurance and power. Okay. So there are times in life when we are exerting our power and trying to be effective in the world. And Hod is when we are simply present, still, radiating our presence. So whether you understand this as God's power and God's providence, or human striving and stillness. And if it's a little confusing, I just want to say the Kabbalah does not really spend all that much time on Netzach and Hod. It spends much more time on Chochmah and Bina, and on Chesed and Gevurah, Chesed and Din, and Tiferet, and then the two Sefirot that I'm going to come to at the moment, which are the two quote-unquote lower Sefirot. I just want to pause for a moment to ask if there are any questions about Netzach and Hod. There could be a lot of questions like, I don't understand what that means, but feel free to ask questions. Power and providence, or striving and stillness. It's the best I can do with it. By the way, that's more than I understood before 3 weeks ago. I used to say Netzach and Hod, I don't understand that. And I ask other people about it and they'll say, yeah, I don't get much about that either. And I think that's really because the Kabbalah is not it's not as interested in those aspects of God, attributes of God, as it is in the other ones that I mentioned. Any questions before we go on? Okay. Below them is Yesod, which means foundation, which is seen as a male trait, which in the humanoid version of the tree of Sefirot is associated with the male phallus. Okay. This idea of Sefirot is highly gendered. Okay. And it's associated with it's the male principle in life, the generative principle, generatively male or masculinely generative. It is associated with the patriarch of Yosef, which is why in, again, the traditional 7 Ushpizin ancestors who we invite into the sukkah, Yosef is after Moshe and Aharon. You might ask, well, chronologically, that's out of order. He should be after Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but that's because the Sefirot, the Ushpizin, the guests we invite into the sukkah, are not in chronological order. They're in Sefirot order, and Yesod is associated with Joseph. Why would the masculine principle of Yesod be associated with Joseph? That's a toss-up question. Why would male sexuality be associated with Yosef? I'll give you a hint. He's also called Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the righteous one. And this Sefirah, Yesod, is sometimes called Tzadik. What did Joseph do that would get him associated with male generativity? with the Sefirot of Yesod? Or I'll ask the question differently. What did Joseph not do that would get him associated with the Sefirot of Yesod?
Well, he didn't give up. He didn't give up his heritage.
Nope. I'm asking a question about
He didn't
sex.
sleep
Sex,
with
Michael.
Potiphar's wife.
Thank you, Deborah. He did not sleep with Potiphar's wife. He maintained sexual purity and continence. So a lot of stuff in the Zohar about Yesod is about. By the way, it may strike some of us. There are parts of the Kabbalah that'll grab you. There are parts of the Kabbalah that might not grab you. This is one of the ones that might not grab you. There's a lot in the Zohar about Yesod, Tzaddik, and it's about the Brit Milah, the bris, and keeping the sanctity of one's bris, which means the sanctity of your sexuality, which means having sexuality being controlled and limited. There's an irony in the classical Kabbalah. I'm just going to say this very briefly because there have been pages and pages and books written about this. The irony in the classical Kabbalah is male and female in the universe have become divided, and thus there are various meditations and practices where the male and female need to be reunited, which makes it sound to you like the Kabbalah would be very sexy, okay? And what we call nowadays, I have a daughter who teaches sex ed. I think we call it nowadays sex positive. That's the term. But in fact, in the classical Kabbalah, this sexiness must be very, very, very strictly limited and challenged. So the actual sex described in the Kabbalah, and now I mean physical sex, is actually pretty unsexy. So on the one hand, there needs to be reuniting of the male and the female. We'll talk more about that. On the other hand, it must be done in total strictness and purity. Okay, so it's so Yesod is really about masculine generativity, but strictly limited and pure, which means, if I can be concrete, only married men, only with your wife, only in certain times, places, and manners, right? And there's debate, for example, in the Talmud about, whether couples are allowed to do sexy pillow talk or not. One rabbi encourages sexy pillow talk, and then another rabbi says, no, absolutely not, absolutely not. All right, and one rabbi encourages uncovering the body, whatever gives people pleasure, and then another rabbi says, no, you only uncover what's absolutely necessary. Okay, nakedness is not encouraged. And classical Kabbalah generally comes down on the side of, I'm going to call it, limited sexuality. There's got to be sexuality, but it's got to be very strictly regulated and limited.
So no mixed dancing.
No mixed dancing, okay? Or only mixed dancing, only certain times and places when we invited you for mixed dancing, and that's it, and not out of there. And actually, Yesod is associated with male sexuality, but it's restrained sexuality, restrained generativity. There's a lot about that in the Kabbalah. They're really, I just want to say, the Zohar is really hung up on this. All right, it's really hung up on, if the author of the Zohar went to see a psychoanalyst, they would definitely say, this is a hang up that you have, okay? It's really about male continence, restraint, and proper sexuality. No spilling of seed incorrectly. All seed needs to be used generatively. Very anti-masturbation, very anti-non-heterosexual intercourse. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. And this is clearly a masculine, by the way, Malchut Tiferet is seen as a masculine quality. Yesod is seen as a masculine quality. Then Malchut, the 10th Sefirah, is seen as a female quality. It's associated with Rachel. I might have mentioned to you that Bina is associated, I said this last week, not this week. Bina, the female discernment, is associated with Leah, sometimes called the upper mother, and Rachel is the lower mother. So a quote unquote higher representation of female qualities and a quote unquote lower representation of female qualities, called Malchut. Malchut is also frequently called Malchut, as you know, probably means kingship, sovereignty. What does that mean? It's usually meant to mean the Shekhinah, God's presence with us in the world. So in rabbinic thinking in the Talmud, when it says the Shekhinah goes into exile with us, that means God's presence, but they don't really think very systematically about what the Shekhinah is. Okay? Remember, for the priestly idea in the Torah, God's presence is called a kavod, and it lives in the Mishkan, right, the tabernacle, and then in the Beit HaMikdash, it lives in the Holy of Holies. Then the rabbis, Ezekiel has a vision of God's kavod leaving the temple right before the temple is destroyed in 586 BCE. That's how God allows the temple to be destroyed, because God's presence leaves the temple. In rabbinic midrash, the Talmudic era, this is turned into the Shekhinah, and it goes into exile with us. But it's not really thought about systematically. Are Shekhinah and God the same thing, right? The Kabbalah tries to systematize this and say Malchut, the lowest Sefirah, the lowest attribute of God, which receives all the energy from the upper 9 Sefirot. So Malchut somehow gathers everything all together, is the Shekhinah. It is God's indwell. This part is important. So if your eyes glazed over, stay with me. It is the attribute of God that is indwelling in the universe. And there's some strands in the Kabbalah that would say, and that's the only aspect of God that is accessible to us at all. Only the 10th and lowest Sefirah, that is God's indwelling in the universe, called the Shekhinah, okay, which is conceived of as female. And again, this is part of the theory of sexuality, the gendered theory of sexuality in the Zohar and the classical Kabbalah. The male principle is generative, and the female principle is receptive, okay? Like the male body and the female body, right? So, or their understanding of the female body. I corrected myself in time, hopefully, okay? So Malchut, the female principle in the world, receives all of the energy from all of the Sefirot above. That's the only aspect of God that is present in our world. That's why we called it the Shekhinah, because Shekhinah means indwelling aspect of God. And this makes it complicated, it is also sometimes referred to in the Kabbalah as, I actually think that I've been thinking about this idea lately. I was thinking about it a month or two ago. I think it's pretty deep. It's also called Knesset Yisrael, which means the full totality, a gathering of Israel, the Jewish people. So the Shekhinah, God's presence in the world, is the totality of the Jewish nation. I'm going to say that in reverse order. The totality of the Jewish nation is or makes manifest God's presence in the world. And that's a pretty Kabbalistic idea, right? Like all of the mitzvot that we do make God's presence in the world. And I think this is verging on I don't want to say verging. It is a way to unite or combine. I think this needs more unpacking. I'll come back to Shekhinah in a future week. This might be seen as a way to combine a humanistic view of God's presence in the world with what's not humanistic? I don't know, theistic, something like that. Theistic view of God's presence in the world. Okay? That Malchut is both the Shekhinah, God's indwelling in the universe, and Knesset Yisrael, the totality of Israel. I'm going to pause. We'll talk more about that last piece, the Shekhinah, And how can it be God's presence, but how could it be the Jewish people, and how could they be the same thing? So I'm going to try to talk more about that next week. But I'm just going to pause briefly, and then we got to wrap up. Larry H.
Yeah, I'm going to try to put all my questions into one.
Okay.
It's more or less a meta question. So up to now, my feeling is that what you've been trying to do is take a historical view of the concept of God, so it will eventually better inform how we think about God in our prayers.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, how essential is this unit on Kabbalah and Zohar to that exercise? Do you see this as being absolutely essential for us to be able to better, I don't know what the verb would be, the noun, but to realize or enhance our own prayers? Or is this a section that we could skip if we wanted?
It depends who. My short answer is it depends who. Sorry. I'll paraphrase the old joke that can't be told publicly anymore. What do you mean we, Larry?
Right.
Okay. So my answer to your question is, and I think I foreshadowed this last time. To some people, this is just theosophical gobbledygook, okay, that just complicates things. And to other people, this is illuminating. So it's, by the way, I don't have an agenda for which parts of Jewish theology are more or less important to you, whoever you is. It's whatever works for you. So for some people to say, yes, now I get it. Their system is their understanding of how God's energy flows into the universe in different ways. At one moment, a baby is being born and breathes its first breath and cries. At another moment, a human being breathes their last breath and their soul leaves their body and they are no longer here. Okay? There's chesed and there's din, and the perfect balance is tiferet. And now I get it. And there are different prayers, right? And again, those little Kabbalistic incantations before some prayers and some Siddurim. I am having the intention to unite God's Yud-He with God's Vav-He, meaning the world is fundamentally fractured. And we didn't get to the fracture yet. That'll be about male and female. That's the Zohar's idea of fracture, and the Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria, has a different view about what the fracture is, okay? But both schools of Kabbalistic thought say the world is fundamentally fractured. How do you know that? Just look at it, okay? Our job is to knit, K-N-I-T, knit the fractures back together, okay? Part of how we do that is mitzvot. Part of how we do that is with intentions in our prayer, all right? And we talked last week about how the 7, quote-unquote, lower Sefirot, which are the ones accessible to us, since Keter, Bina, and Chokhmah are generally not accessible to us. The 7 lower Sefirot are mapped liturgically onto the 7 weeks of the Omer, the day of the week in each day of the Omer, the 7 Ushpizin. So there are all sorts of, I will call them, loosely speaking, meditative / therapeutic practices and intentions, kavanot, that help us focus on different aspects of how divinity is present in the universe. So, sorry, long answer, Larry. It works for some people, and for other people, it's just confusing. I don't follow it. Why do you need all this? So I'm not going to tell you if it's important to you or not, because, we have a universe of 40 listeners out there to our podcast, one of whom is in China, and I don't know if it's useful for that person in China or not. I have no idea. Okay, so for some people, yes, God must be a very complex being with different aspects. Okay, so and at one moment I'm I don't know who this is. At one moment I'm praying for someone to be healed from illness, and at another moment I am praying for someone to win a war. I must somehow be, I don't want to say praying to, because that was it's an overly simplified formulation. I must somehow be thinking of and meditating on different aspects of God in those two different prayers. Okay, so this is how Kabbalah, I want to go back to the beginning of polytheism and monotheism. Polytheism says there are clearly forces in conflict in the universe. The universe is very complicated. Monotheism says, nope, they're all manifestations of one unified force. Kabbalah, classical Kabbalah, in some way, sort of tries to harmonize the two by saying it can appear that there are many different forces. They're all manifestations of the one force that channel through different channels, and so therefore we may experience them differently at different times. They're all one God, but the one God is manifold and complex, as opposed to Maimonides, who says they're all the one God. We can't know anything about the one God, and anything we say is a metaphor. And this is where Kabbalah is different. It says, no, it's not a metaphor. It is human language, but God actually manifests through different attributes and aspects. Maimonides would say, it only looks like that to us. It's an illusion. Kabbalah would say, no, it actually, divinity flows into different channels. This is my overview of how that works. So it's all one thing, or it flows through different channels. I don't know, whichever works for you in your davening. That's my long answer, Larry. And I think, so I'm not going to decide if it's important or not. Okay.
Okay.
Is that a fair, I don't know. It may work for, I don't, I should say, have everyone, the 40 listeners in the world send me an email, and say, does this help or hinder? Is this confusing or is it really interesting? So I don't know the answer. Everyone's different. Any other questions or comments? Thank you. That was a useful question, comment. And it's kind of whatever, I don't know. I will summarize, Larry, in the very profound response, whatever floats your boat. Okay. Any other final question, comments? We're running over. Got to stop. Okay.
I think it's great you do this because it's a new time for you to look into it, and it's part of the complete thing.
There you go. Thank you. Bernie's right, Larry. I'm just trying to give you the complete thing. Okay. And trying hard to not privilege. Obviously, there are times when you'll hear me. I'm a human being, so it's impossible to 100% suppress my editorializations, although I try to, right? But I'm really trying to not privilege different ways of understanding divinity in Judaism. I'm just trying to do my best to lay out for people how it worked for people at different times and places. What stands behind the Sefirot, okay, is an idea, though, is a sense that the world, I think this is what stands behind the Sefirot. It's an idea that the world doesn't seem to work as neatly as you would think it should work if there's one principle underlying everything. It seems more complicated and internally at odds at times than you would think. And this is their way of trying to address that. And I guess I have to talk more in a future week, in the next few weeks, about the fractures. So I'm going to get to the fractures. Okay. Got to stop. Let's all pray for a peaceful election day.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.